Welcome to the Petro Papers podcast. Say that 10 times fast. This is where you get your oil and gas intellectual stimulation by asking the technical questions. I'm Yogashri Pradhan, and with me here today, I have Adam Turner and Katie Donahue from Geomark. I'm going to read a little bit about them before we dive into the weeds of the paper. And the paper that we're going to talk about is URTEC 372-0662. Paper title and the description is in the description box below for our viewers and listeners on YouTube and on Apple Podcasts. Now I'm going to read a little bit about Adam Turner. He is a geoscience doctorate in geochemistry with 5 years of more experience in supporting exploration, development, and production of upstream oil and gas through research, analysis, and integration, utilizing inorganic and organic geochemistry, well log analysis, and formation evaluation, SEM, and core scale reservoir quality analysis, seismic stratigraphy, and computer modeling to contribute hydrocarbon system development and evaluation. Proven success in proposing, planning, and executing unconventional wells in the Permian Basin. Now I'm going to read a little bit about Katie Donahue. She's a director of petroleum science, system science at Geomark Research. She also served as a geochemical advisor. She served as a senior geoscientist at Marathon Oil Corporation and a senior geoscientist and geochemist at Apache, as well as a senior geoscientist at BH Billiton. Now I'm going, as I mentioned before, we're going to cover URTEC 372-0662. Welcome to the podcast, both of you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
Awesome. Well, I wanted to reorient our viewers and listeners a little bit. If you can talk about the paper and the methodology.
Sure. Yeah. So this is a time-lapse geochemistry paper, and so it might be useful to kind of define that term a little bit and what it's used for. So time-lapse geochemistry is really a process, especially in unconventional reservoirs, where we're trying to understand where your fluids are coming from, how they're moving through the subsurface, and how it changes through time. And so to do that, we're really, it's as simple as taking a sample from a wellhead and doing it repetitively through time, and taking a series of measurements in our labs, and relating that back to what's going on in subsurface through both allocation processes, and then also looking at the chemical changes as a function of things like whether or not there's some kind of a subsurface flow baffle, or if there's some type of a rock fluid interaction that can lead to things like we call it a permeability sieve, which is basically just the rocks actually kind of metering what types of molecules can travel through these really low porosity systems and get to the wellbore. So yeah, time-lapse geochemistry is kind of this catch-all term that is really the study of fluids, especially coming from these unconventional reservoirs through time.
Yeah, I guess I just want to add there, one of the reasons we really appreciate being invited to be on the podcast is so geochemistry is the tool that we go to for this, but we don't want it to only be used by geochemists. We want it to be tied to production. You're producing these oils anyway. It's great to take as much information as you can, but we need to communicate it to the engineers, to some of the decision makers as they're trying to optimize their development programs. Everybody's trying to get as efficient as possible. So really what this paper is kind of trying to describe some of these applications, the consequence of some of the decisions that you make with designing a program and what you want to be looking for in that data set, and just get everybody comfortable seeing the benefits of this sort of technique.
So what we did with this paper is we started off by kind of diving into the weeds about really what makes a time-lapse geochemistry program work, especially with relation to allocation. So that's the stratigraphic units that are contributing to the actual wellbore. And we showed kind of some of the strengths and the pitfalls that can come out of that. If you think it through properly and you're choosing the right inputs, then you can get a really meaningful result. But it's that kind of old saying, garbage in, garbage out. So you have to be careful about, what you select to put into the models that we were using for this particular paper. And then we go into a couple different case studies, one in the Delaware and one in the Eagle Ford, in which we do that kind of proper deconvolution technique and come up with a couple of interesting case studies where in one paper we separate out a couple flow units. And so you can see how these things interact with each other, the different landing zones through time. And in the second case study, it's actually a really neat application where we have some produced fluids from wells that have recently been put into the ground, and compare that back to some area wells. And we're able to actually delineate in the Eagle Ford that the newer producers are producing only from the lower Eagle Ford and not from the upper Eagle Ford, which turned out to be pretty meaningful for our operator partner.
Yeah, I mean, these kind of cover some fairly typical questions that we get. We find we answer a lot of the same questions of, can you tell a difference between, two wells landed in the same zone? Can you see differences? Can you see differences if I'm pulling from outside of my proposed zone? Can I see differences over time? So again, we may kind of try to establish this as a conversation to address all of those directly, make sure everybody feels comfortable having a basis to continue that conversation. And I'm sure everybody's aware, time-lapse geochemistry has been around for a few years. It's certainly built on a more historically established conventional application of it, but it's continued to kind of be discussed as a potential application in these resource plays. And I don't feel like, with the conversations we have throughout the industry, not every operator is on the same level of understanding of how to use it and how to apply it. So some people kind of still see it as a bit of a new technology, and we definitely want to open that up to make sure that people understand the measurements. A lot of the lab portion isn't necessarily so new. The question is what you're doing with it and how we can advance and answer, harder and harder questions moving forward.
Excellent. I know that when I read this paper, I was extremely excited to have both of you on the podcast and start peppering you with questions, not just because there's a Delaware Basin based paper and I work mostly in the Delaware Basin, but just I might be the strange engineer that really likes geochemistry or likes to get some insight from geochemistry. So
there's a few of you out there. We should start a club or something. But absolutely, when we can integrate, when we can talk across the disciplines, it's such an advantage. Such an advantage.
Perfect. I wanted to start with something a little bit more foundational, especially in your workflow that you've mentioned in the paper, and you've mentioned this in several papers. And I'm familiar with the workflow too. But could you describe principal component analysis and hierarchical clustering, which is pretty much the foundation of trying to figure out which oils are different in determining whether if you are producing from the same zone or not?
Yeah, so these are some very powerful tools. They're also really just that. They're tools to analyze the data. So we start from a set of inputs. These are our geochemical ratios. They're tried and true, very well studied things that we can point to and say, pristine phytane is changing. And so that means that, our source is changing, something like that. But there are tons of these different compounds that we want to look at all at once. And so it turns out that some of these kind of advanced statistical techniques are incredibly useful at simplifying the problem. So while we start out going through each individual compound, then we tend to look and see which ones are working for an individual basin, or sometimes even subparts of the basin, because the subsurface is so variable that sometimes these things work and sometimes they don't. So you look for what's working, and then you create a subset of the data from different instruments. We use things from our IRMS, isotopes, we use bulk parameters, we use things like the GCMS biomarkers. And we pick out some of these that are working well, and we feed them into different analytics, such as PCA. PCA stands for Principal Component Analysis. And what you're doing is really simplifying large data sets into a reduced frame of reference. So you're taking a mini multivariate problem, and you're reducing it down to a new series of axes that maximize the variability. So it's just complicated linear algebra, really. But it's you get something that looks like a regular XY axis, but it's really a factor 1 and a factor 2, which is a new series of axes to look at. And with PCA especially, it really helps to illustrate if things are similar or dissimilar. And then it also really helps at looking at mixing trends. So in unconventional resources, especially, we tend to see things that kind of move along trends through time. And that's related back to your drained rock volume many times, which is basically the volume of rock that's contributing to your wellbore. That tends to change. Then also, as we mentioned, things like the rock fluid interactions can actually start to change the character, the chemical character of the oil that's being produced. And so you can see those things tend to shift along PCA axis. Hierarchical cluster analysis is just it's another form of statistical analysis. It's really good for looking at how similar things are. So PCA, principal component analysis, picks out how things covary. HCA is how similar things are. It's super useful for defining things like oil families. So if it comes from the same source or if it's housed in the same reservoir, it's not quite as useful at looking at some of these mixing trends, but it's a great statistical analysis to look at these similarities.
Yeah, I mean, I like, and it was key, like in the beginning, you just described these as tools, right? So you pick the kind of screwdriver you need for the problem at hand. So sometimes you're maximizing differences, sometimes you're specifically looking for similarities. And again, the PCA, HCA, any of this kind of multivariate analysis, that's not unique to geochemistry or this industry. These are fairly available, accessible tools. And so we prefer that methodology so that everybody can participate. It's a little easier. You can have data analytics teams that absolutely can kind of follow the conversation we're having and participate in it. So we find that to be an advantage in, if you will, selling some of what we do, because you can reproduce it. We can share that workflow with somebody and they can follow our logic and our understanding of what we've done. Now, they may not understand, they may need our help in translating what some of the measured parameters are, because like we said, we like to use things that are already defined. They have a whole background to them as to how they are produced by the geologic record and why they are what they are and how they are expected to change. But then when the math part, we can share and we can share that conversation.
And what we like to do is, for our case studies in this paper, we'll take something like PCA, which is that it takes all of these different things and mashes it into a single plot. But then we pair that with some of the molecular indicator plots by themselves so that you can start to think, okay, you're seeing this change across PCA. That's great. It moves in PCA space. What does that actually mean in the physical subsurface? And so we can split out some of these molecular indicators. In this case, for these case studies, we split it out into 3 different boxes. We've got something that describes family. So that's really kind of the source and reservoir part of the system. We have something that describes mobility. So that's how mobile the fluids are. And that turns out to be an incredibly important part of the story. And then there's maturity as well. So there's molecular indicators that really describe maturity. And so using these kind of tried and true molecules paired with the statistics, we get kind of a more complete answer. And you get to really dive into the data while not ignoring parts of it either.
It gets back to that time domain, and that's what's so exciting. So the family, all of those can be the family mobility and maturity do not have to vary in sync given what's going on during production. So it's one of the points that is sometimes difficult for some operators to understand. Sometimes they get it really quick because it makes sense to solving their problems. But you don't have to change the family you're pulling from in order to recognize changes in your mobility or of the maturity of the fluids. And that can really help change the frame of reference from what they were looking at, like some kind of observed, we'll call it a problem, but sometimes anything that's not going according to plan, they need a solution for it. So they're seeing some change in their properties. And if you just stop at square one and think it's coming from a different location, it doesn't make sense. So having this extra depth to the interpretation really helps.
It's sorry, I don't mean to keep talking, Yoshi. You can jump in at any point. But it's part of the paper actually that if you ignore the causes of the change and you just look for any kind of change, you can end up allocating your fluids to places that they don't really belong. So
Don't make
it's-
sense.
Yeah.
Like doesn't honor the geology.
Perfect. Like I mentioned, I get excited about the workflow, and I also want to share with other people what exactly is the PCA and the hierarchical clustering, what exactly you're doing in order to understand different families and to understand the data really.
Yeah.
I wanted to pivot to production allocation and sampling results, which is pretty much that crux of the paper. And I've been thinking a lot about wettability and rel perm. How does that affect the sampling results and production allocation?
It's an interesting question. It delves into really the complexities of the subsurface. It's
Fluid rock interaction.
it's the fluid rock interactions that we've been talking about. Yeah. So, with our allocations, kind of a first order is to start thinking about how it relates to the stratigraphic relation, right? But then, the more detailed look is coming into these rock fluid interactions. And for a really interesting case that I actually just saw that wasn't in this report, but you have things from the same family, but they have different rock fluid interactions. You have different reservoir quality. And so you actually get different chemical character coming out from the same family. It's really interesting. And so the wettability and the relative permeability, it's really important to consider in the story, and it has absolute impact on the produced fluid.
It does. So like, yeah, will it have a consequence on the allocation, like on that value? Well, essentially, yes. We can see differences. We can measure differences in the chemistry of these samples. And if we know that it's the same family, we know what conditions are being held consistent. So what is different, we can see from the samples that have been collected. And again, integration with the teams. As always, these subsurface problems are never going to be solved by a single variable, right? So we know in this case, like that he's talking about, that is pretty cool. We know the differences in those, what we'll call reservoir properties. So they're, rock properties, but it is going to be a rel perm, and we can see what we're holding in as a control to this experiment. And we can see that we can measure these differences and what's being affected, tie it back to those specific molecular parameters that really help us get a better understanding that in certain units, that rel perm question is going to be so much more significant. And in others, maybe not so much. You're just not experiencing that kind of variability. You can treat things in more of a lump sum fashion. So while the answer to how much it's going to affect the results changes from case to case, we do have the ability to help tell you if it's going to matter or not. And so that can be an advantage in of itself with a lot of these complicated reservoir models that we run, that you don't want to just leave it as a question mark. You want to know if it's a bigger risk and a variable you need to control, or if you can kind of move on, if you will.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks for that clarification. I also wanted to talk about a topic that I get really interested in when it comes to geochemistry data, is the drainage volume and quantifying that drainage volume. So how can one quantify that drainage volume from the sampling data? And then have you seen correlations of depleted areas having larger drainage volumes?
Yeah, so drained rock volume is one of the things that we get asked about most often. And it's really what this program, what our time-lapse geochemistry, it's really built to solve that problem. And so how you quantify the drained rock volume is kind of the crux of every discussion that we have with operators. And it really depends on the baseline that you choose. And it depends on the questions that are being asked. So we find that often operators want to know, hey, are these two landing zones in communication with each other? And so the question that they're asking is really, are we having two flow units? Are these things separate, or is it a single flow unit? Are they in communication? And so that requires a type of baseline that's pretty coarse, right? We would want to know, are these two oils the same or different? Other operators want to know much more detailed quantified drained rock volume. And so for that
Footage.
Yeah. So then we can use baselines built off of either core extracts or cutting extracts. there's challenges with that as well, because anytime you have an extract process, we have various ways of extracting the fluids from the rock. And we've gotten really good at, kind of replicating what that natural fluid would look like. But no matter how good you are at replicating what that natural fluid looks like, it's still that extract is a single timestamp, right? So there's the fluids change through time as a natural process of being kind of pulled through this low permeability system. And so at time X, you're going to have a different fluid at time 1. So if your extract does a great job of matching time 1, your time X is going to be different, but it's not because your drain drop volume changed. It's because the actual chemistry of the fluid is changing. So it's looking at your drain drop volume, and then it's comparing that back to whatever baseline that you've created, and creating a series of end members. I typically like to work with the smallest number of end members that will answer the client's question. That's how you tend to get some robust answers. But again, it's whatever answers the questions that clients have.
Yeah, I mean, you can really complicate some of these scenarios, right? Where there's like infinite possibilities. So sometimes I'd say the short answer to that, the drain rock volume or DRV, like, can we give you a DRV? Yes, we can. But depending on what stage that operator is in, how much more additional information can we add to it to reduce the uncertainties around that value? So it's not if we can give an answer, it's almost more of a how good is the answer, I would say, and that will continue to improve with higher resolution of the samples, like you're mentioning with the core. And then what is important, again, getting to the time lapse question, that I think, the DRV, what do people even need to know that for? Are you asking about DRV yesterday, or are you asking about it in the future looking forward? And those can be two different scenarios and for two different purposes. When you're trying to, was it a good decision we made yesterday? Should I invest more? I mean, so you want to be able to answer in both directions. The subtlety I'd add on there to kind of communicate how we'd like people to think about the situation. And again, while we use the tools we do, like using those extracts or core samples or any single point from the subsurface, that's one dimensional. We're putting it into essentially 2D space when that's coming from a lateral. Then you're running a completion or a fracking net, which almost makes it 3D. And then you're going to produce it over time. So you have a 4D question. Do you want to use a 1D data set to answer a 4D question? Well, sometimes it's all you've got. So I'll take that over nothing. But how can I expand my data set to go beyond one dimensional and get a 4D data set for a 4D solution? And that's where taking these samples over time, being able to look at them in the reference to what I know I communicated through some of this frac, some of this completion, that all rolls into the story of giving a more accurate DRV description.
Awesome. It does take a lot of pieces of data to converge to a conclusion.
The best projects that we have are those where we have a lot of great integration. We can give a geochemical answer, that's consistent with all the data we have, and it's incredibly useful. But the best answers and the most fun answers for me is when I get to pull in all this other kind of data and really integrate it into a full story with the reservoir quality, with the inorganic geochemistry, with whatever else I can get my hands on.
That 4D part, again, calling out to the engineers, the production data and all those observations on what happened on the subsurface. Oh, did you change the choke? Oh, did you shut in for a little while? Like, all of that does affect things. So it's really nice to know that beforehand. But integration is key, like you said.
We just gave a SPWLA paper as well, in which the production data, so the actual fluid production data, played a huge part in the story. So it was really fun.
Yeah,
highly recommend it. I can give a reading list out.
Oh, that's great, because after the podcast, what I was going to do is, if you can send me that reading list, I'll put it in the description box. So
that'd be great.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
we can have viewers and listeners just check out those papers as well. I tend to put just the citation of the specific paper that I interview on, but if you have additional, feel free to send it my way.
Sounds great.
Awesome. And you can guarantee that I provide a lot of feedback, and I do provide a lot of questions in terms of what do a lot of things mean when it comes to chemical data. So
that's my favorite kind of talks and presentations are those where people jump in, they ask me what they want to know, because all the data is there. It's just trying to communicate what people want to know.
Yeah.
So
well, you need to ask Crystalline, because I provide a lot of feedback and I provide a lot of questions. So
perfect.
She's gotten an equal from me. I want to move back to PCA.
Yeah.
And because I think it's just been the foundation of the workflow. And how can those results interpret fracture closure or the end of communication?
Oh, that's a great question. So as I kind of mentioned in the beginning, your PCA is great at looking at your mixing trends. So as you have fracture closure, if those fractures were contributing fluids to the wellbore, they're going to have some type of character imparted on it. So as those fractures close, it closes off that part of the reservoir. And so you tend to see movement in the PCA space. This is again where where it's important to have some type of baseline fluids, have some type of a reference. And, let's use Wolfcamp as an example, because everybody loves Wolfcamp. If I've got a lower A well that's been producing forever and that DRV is as small as it's ever going to be, it's useful to plot that in my PCA space for the newly landed Wolfcamp A wells to see, hey, are they, deflecting off somewhere over here and then becoming more like that old Wolfcamp A through time, or how are they changing with relation to each other? So PCA is really useful for looking for that relative change to each other.
And again, seeing the direction it's going. So in the paper, there's a couple of examples of what we call the TED plots, and that those are trying to summarize some of the information that we do see from the PCA. If you look at the PCA directly, you can get more information because it's not as simple. We have the luxury here at Geomark that we do have a lot of context. We have a big library of samples. So when we say it looks, we don't have to even settle for saying it looks like Wolfcamp A. We can say it looks like Wolfcamp A from this county. So the way things move away from some of those control clouds and go towards something else, when you look at a PCA that's delivered from a database, so Geomark has one, but a lot of operators even have them internally in their own company. That's why we would recommend that, right? So take a lot of samples from what you're producing. It's not, when you look at it in that cloud, it's not just about where it's going to what it's who else it's joining. So you not only can you say if a fracture is closing that now no longer that's contributing, sometimes other things open up. Sometimes you're completing something else nearby. So when you see other activity coming in, maybe there's something new that's being added to it, you want to know where it's coming from. And using tools like PCA allow us to have that context to what we're interpreting.
And again, the PCA is super useful in indicating change, right? But it can be less useful for telling you what that change is. So it's kind of like throwing up a flag. When you see these things progressing in the PCA space, it's okay, now let's kind of dive into the data and really understand what's driving that change.
That's a lot of the other kind of advanced interpretation, and that why it matters that we understand what those molecules that are being affected by that change. Is it something that makes sense to have come from that original source rock family? Is it something that does look, maybe it's more of a reservoir indicator, rel perm or molecular sieve, or there's a bunch of different ways we could kind of try and classify it, or something that we even think is operational, something that you can control.
In our Delaware Basin example that we have in this paper, again, the PCA is kind of two axes. There's the factor 1 space and factor 2 space. And in factor 1, that's controlled largely by changes in landing zones. So that's your stratigraphic variability. But then it's a really interesting trend in that your samples will be contained to kind of that stratigraphic domain until the last timestamp, and then they jump up in factor 2 space. So we interpret that as being a shift in the mobility of the oil that's being produced rather than a change in the stratigraphic contribution. So you can, through some additional interpretation, you can start to understand, what the relative changes actually mean in PCA space. But it's useful for telling you need to go and look in it a little bit deeper.
Awesome. Thanks for that clarification. I have a broad question. I feel like this will take quite a bit of time to answer because,
Perfect.
and I also think that y'all's geochemistry course might be the one to answer this question. But what kinds of components are you looking at into your analysis, and what do those correlations present?
Yeah, I mean, that's the crux of it. So we look at a large variety, and you're right, we have a geochemical course in which we go through a binder that's this thick, and each page represents a different ratio.
Some of the books behind us.
Yeah, yeah. And so, these things have been studied for the past 50, 60, many years. And so we go through, and they're based on a variety of instruments. We have GC, GCMS, isotopic ratio mass spectrometer, IRMS. We have our QQQ. There's lots of different instruments that all feed together, and that's kind of an internal check as well. They're all telling you similar things, and you can start to feel good about it. But we use ratios that describe family mobility and maturity, really, but it's things like Christine Fighting, it's things like Sarah ratios, it's things like so we look at the light end ratios to tell us a lot of different things. Maturity can be, there's the methylphenanthrene index, there's something simple like API. We have a QQQ maturity trend that we published on a few times that is a nice maturity indicator. So there's many.
I feel like the famous ones people get. So the non-geochemists, they always ask about oleanine, which is, again, generated from flowering plants and is great for indicating if you're late Cretaceous and into the tertiary. That's one people ask about. And gamastarine is the other one people have heard of. I feel like maybe people use it in Scrabble or something, but those are, specific, measurable organic compounds that we can point to. We know kind of how they've evolved, what plants generate them, and bacteria and algae, et cetera, and so forth. But so that's what makes it so tangible. You can really point to what that environment must have looked like at time of deposition and what's happened to it through the rock record. And now we're measuring it in the lab. And it's not just theory. It's, we can walk around and see an oleander today in Florida. And like it kind of connects everything back and does make it real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But so we do have extensive classes. It's and I would also in favor of the using geochemistry as a tool. Yes, Geomark specializes that, and obviously we're very excited and have a lot of fun with it all the time. We've developed a lot of the equipment we have in the lab is not necessarily unique to us. It's about what you want to do with it. Mm-hmm. There's so many questions. There's a lot of different directions. So always, kind of investigate all of your options. But I really do like to promote everybody understanding that kind of data they get. Again, never be afraid to talk to the lab that you are using and ask those questions. Go through that data with them. In a typical class that we would run, or a lot of people would run, it's not just the definitions of those parameters, but what you might want to ask for in an analytical program. Again, there can be confusion about everybody sees the Stegosaurus plots for the GCs. Okay, well, so people need to know that is from a gas chromatogram and not from the mass spectrometer. Those are two different things. And until somebody sits you down and walks you through it, you don't necessarily know. But those are important stuff we cover in the class.
You guys have specific dates on when you hold those classes, or is it just by request?
Both. So we do have one actually coming up. We're actually settling on the dates that would probably be September. Okay. But we do them on request, and so and particularly like that tends to be a little more efficient for specific operators, because what's nice is if we can even use your own data, so you don't have to worry about who's sitting next to you in the class. And people can bring in their real world questions. I'd say pre-COVID, back in the day, when we would do, say, like a 3-day oils class that will go through a lot of detail, and then the 4th day is applied. Bring in your questions. So now that you've gotten a little bit of background, let's spend some time showing you how to use it. So So you don't walk away from the class, get your little certificate and your binder, and then next Monday morning, you're like, wait, it seems so easy at the time. That always happens. Like, it makes sense when somebody's explaining it to you, but we like to sit down and walk people through it while we're there.
And there's plans, still in plans for a time-lapse geochemistry course, and that'll be really fun.
Yeah.
That's something that I think we're all pretty passionate about, and it's gonna be a lot of fun.
Absolutely, a great way for us to get feedback. Like, again, in this program and like in some of our publications, we are really working towards making sure that we're communicating our results in applied formats. It's definitely a teach a man to fish sort of philosophy. Yes. We want, for a time-lapse program, we would want that operating team to be handling it most of the time, 80% of the time. You know, to call us if something looks weird or different, or a new issue has come up, but you should feel comfortable using and working with this data and knowing why it matters.
Yeah.
Excellent. The reason why I asked is if you guys had an upcoming course, I was going to put that in the description as well. If you guys,
we'll put a date on there for you.
Yeah, perfect. No, just for for listeners who want to learn more. So
absolutely,
that'd be great.
Absolutely. No, the courses are a lot of fun. They're very useful.
I have a specific question now. It's
okay.
now related to it's related to the Eagleford case study. So how does one interpret outliers or points that don't follow the trend of the correlation plots when determining oil families? So I'm referring to 12. So there is a figure 12B. I'm not saying just flip through you can flip through the paper if you want, but there is, well, he came prepared. There's a figure 12B.
Got it here. We're
yes.
Good.
And it's regarding the upper Eagleford. So there's some outliers. So how do you interpret those outliers?
Yeah, so so figure 12B for the listeners, we're looking at a PCA plot here, and it has on it trends for upper Eagleford plots, trends for lower Eagleford, and then trends for the time series that we actually looked at. And I absolutely see what you're saying when we're looking at outliers, because there's a large spread in the data. But it's interesting because there's meaning behind where this data points. And the majority of the trend is along factor 1, which is kind of our pseudo x-axis here. And you can see by the coloring that all of the upper Eagleford is on the far left. The lower Eagleford is in the middle, and our produced fluids are kind of very similar to where that lower Eagleford is. So then there's also some movement in the Y space, and that's something that we actually don't dig into in this paper to really understand what's driving that. But we're looking for that kind of family changes in the X space. So there is meaning, I would say, behind some of these things, and it's important to think about what meaning is important to the question and what is kind of driving more uncertainty, and to be able to quantify that, or at least speak to that uncertainty as well.
I mean, and that would be, you know, again, like, so imagine you were the operator that we worked with here. We would want to have a bit of a dialogue about that, because I would probably say, I wouldn't consider these outliers. Just like Adam's saying, they're all points of information. So I'm not, outliers I may not include in my characterization, my averages or something, you know? So I want to be careful about making sure I'm using a term that's going to be inclusive of all the data, because it all does mean something and indicate things. The other thing is when you see this display, so yeah, Adam's doing a great job of describing factor 1 and factor 2, but it is actually a 3D plot, so it is hard to illustrate on a page. So that can also, you got to take that into account when you're looking through the physical representation of these dots on a page. And then the last thing, again, like I kind of mentioned with the database, there's a lot you're not seeing here that provides context to some of these color-coded families we've put in there. That would also help, you know, if we were having a conversation about it, would really help illustrate why we don't necessarily consider them outliers. They're just behaviors of this program.
Part of what we did in this case study is, or in this paper as well, was really look at what drives some of that variance, and small geographic differences can play a pretty important outsized role in really making these things look different. And so for this case study, what we were doing was we were comparing fluids from across the field and comparing them back to our specific producing wells.
Yeah.
And so you're looking for trends that are associated with things that we're interested in investigating a little bit, while also acknowledging that there is going to be some noise because we're dealing with natural systems, and it always is a complicated place.
Which again gets back to the integration. You don't just use geochemistry, you're going to look for more context, and even again with that part of interpretation, that it's not about identifying differences, it's about identifying significant differences, meaningful differences. And that gets back to being able to trace back what was their cause. Is it something I care about, something I can control, or not?
Awesome. Well, I've peppered you all with a bunch of questions. There is one question I was not going to let either of you get away from.
Perfect.
And it would be, what are some implications from the study or from the paper that we haven't seen before in industry?
That's a great question. So this paper, it does two things really. It's a look at what some of the kind of best practices are for creating a time-lapse geochemistry program and the way that we create it here at Geomark. And then the second thing is really pointing out that the changes that you see are not necessarily due to changes in the drained rock volume. Changes help you to find that drained rock volume, but you can also see things that are related to mobility. And that's something that, if ignored, it can actually get you a wrong answer for your allocation. And I think that's something that the industry is coming around to, but it's a relatively new concept that is incredibly important in these unconventional plays. It's something we didn't have to worry about in the conventional days, but
Right.
in the resource plays, it turns out that it's a very important factor.
Yeah, I totally agree. I find it really exciting. I mean, whenever we can find an operator that's willing to let us publish that kind of data, it's pretty significant. So, a big thank you to Ensign Resources.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, it's a fundamental step change in making sure people understand that you can use geochemistry to go beyond family definitions or that kind of important, but more traditional ask that we have, to really look towards some of these more detailed applications, such as mobility, that really lead to the optimization that can really be, affected by the time stamp that we're looking at. In the big picture, again, I think I really want the community to, and okay, this is a bit of my bias, but I'd love for the community to stop asking if geochemistry works. It absolutely works. We are past that point. We can answer exceedingly more advanced questions. People maybe, and that's why kind of the front half of the paper is just making sure people understand maybe they were asking the wrong question. Maybe they were using the wrong specific subset of tools. But it does work. So if you feel like you weren't getting satisfactory answers, just don't hesitate to, take that cue like you've done and ask questions. Ask questions. There's a lot of answers in this data that we're collecting.
Excellent. Oh, you can bet that I will ask questions.
Good.
Absolutely. That's what we want.
That's what science is about. Yep.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for letting me pepper you with questions on this podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to get to talk about the work a little bit and widen the audience. And it's been a lot of fun.
Fun Friday.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, folks, that's a wrap. This is Petro Papers. I'm Yogashri Pradhan. Make sure you check out the paper 3720662. And if you have any questions, let me know, and I could definitely connect you to Adam and Katie Donahue, or Adam Turner and Katie Donahue from Geomark. I'm Yogashri Pradhan, and I'm signing off.